Welcome Whispers After Midnight. Tonight, we uncover one of the most overlooked voices in history, a man who survived the Titanic in 1912, the only black man known to be on board, who carried his truth in silence for 83 long years before finally telling his story. This isn't just a survival tale. It's a story about erasure, resilience, and history choosing who gets remembered. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and please subscribe, because every video you see here is built on hours of digging through true records, forgotten testimonies, and hidden facts to bring you stories that history nearly buried. In 1912, maritime travel reflected the rigid racial hierarchy of the early 20th century, and the Titanic, despite its reputation as a marvel of modern engineering, was no exception. The world that built the Titanic was divided by class and color, and those divisions were enforced not just socially, but systematically. Black travelers, even when legally permitted to travel, were often undocumented properly, segregated informally, or treated as invisible within official records. Passenger manifests prioritized wealthy elites and prominent white travelers, while people of color were frequently listed inaccurately, reduced to job titles, or omitted entirely. This wasn't always accidental. It was a reflection of how society decided whose lives were worth recording. On ships like the Titanic, class determined access to safety, comfort, and dignity, but race quietly amplified those inequalities. Black individuals were rarely found among first-class passengers, not because they lacked ambition or ability, but because social barriers made such access nearly impossible. If present, they were more likely to be crew members or traveling under limited documentation, making their identities easier to erase after disaster struck. When the Titanic sank, survival narratives quickly centered on wealthy families, famous names, and dramatic heroism that fit a certain image. Stories that did not align with that image, especially those involving black survivors, were pushed aside or forgotten. The racial realities of 1912 also shaped how history was written afterward. Newspapers, investigations, and public memorials largely ignored non-white voices, reinforcing a single narrative of tragedy that excluded others who lived through the same terror. For a black survivor, speaking out carried risks, disbelief, dismissal, or outright hostility. Silence often became a form of survival long after the ship went down. Understanding this context is crucial, because it explains how someone could endure one of the most documented disasters in history and still remain unheard for more than 8 decades. His story wasn't missing because it didn't exist. It was missing because the world of 1912 wasn't ready to listen. The way black passengers were documented, or, in many cases, ignored, in 1912 reveals how history can be shaped as much by prejudice as by facts. Passenger manifests were supposed to be precise records, yet they were deeply selective. Full names, ages, destinations, and family connections were carefully preserved for first- and second-class white passengers. For people of color, documentation was often incomplete, inconsistent, or reduced to a single line that stripped away identity. A black man might be recorded only as a laborer, crew hand, or assistant, without personal details that would allow future historians to trace his life or survival. After the Titanic sank, this imbalance became even more severe. Official inquiries in Britain and the United States relied heavily on testimonies from those considered respectable and authoritative by early 20th century standards. Wealth, race, and social status determined whose voices were amplified. Black survivors who attempted to share their experiences faced skepticism or were excluded altogether from formal questioning. Their statements were rarely printed in newspapers, archived, or cited in reports. As a result, Their experiences existed outside the official historical record, surviving only through memory rather than documentation. This erasure had a compounding effect over time. Later historians, relying on these flawed records, concluded that certain people were never aboard simply because the paperwork did not clearly list them. Absence of evidence became mistaken for evidence of absence. When a black survivor finally spoke decades later, researchers had to look beyond traditional archives, examining immigration records, employment logs, port documents, and oral history to confirm what the official Titanic narrative had long denied. His story exposed a critical truth. The Titanic's history was never fully written, not because witnesses were missing, but because the system chose not to see them. Before boarding the Titanic, his life unfolded in a world shaped by limited opportunity and quiet resilience. As a black man in the early 1900s, his choices were constrained long before he ever set foot on a ship. Employment options were narrow, wages were low, and mobility, both social and geographic, came at a cost. Like many black men of his time, he likely worked in physically demanding jobs that required long hours and offered little recognition, yet provided the one thing he needed most: a chance to move forward. Travel across the Atlantic was not a luxury for him. It was a calculated risk, tied to work, survival, or the hope of something better. His decision to board the Titanic was shaped by necessity rather than grandeur. While first-class passengers boarded with trunks of fine clothing and dreams of prestige, he stepped onto the ship carrying modest belongings and practical expectations. Whether traveling for employment, relocation, or temporary work, his journey was rooted in purpose, not spectacle. The Titanic was advertised as a symbol of progress and safety, but for someone like him, it was simply a means to an end. A powerful vessel that promised passage, not privilege. Social reality followed him onto the dock. He would have been acutely aware of how he was perceived, where he was allowed to stand, and how easily he could be overlooked. Interactions with officials, crew, and fellow travelers were likely brief and transactional. His name may have been written down quickly, inaccurately, or without care. Yet behind that thin line of ink was a full life, family ties, personal struggles, quiet ambitions that no manifest could capture. Understanding his background before the Titanic is essential, because it reminds us that he did not step into history as a footnote. He boarded that ship as a man already shaped by endurance, carrying a story that existed long before the iceberg and would remain unheard long after the waves closed over the sea. His presence was erased from early records not by accident, but by a combination of systemic bias, chaotic record, keeping after the disaster, and a deliberate focus on narratives that fit the social expectations of the time. When the Titanic sank, the immediate priority for authorities and the press was to account for prominent passengers, wealthy families, notable figures, and those whose survival or death would capture public attention. In that rush, individuals who did not hold social power were pushed to the margins. A black survivor, especially one traveling outside the elite classes, was far more likely to be overlooked, misidentified, or excluded altogether. The confusion following the disaster made this erasure easier. Survivor lists were compiled hastily from lifeboat testimonies, hospital admissions, and second-hand reports. Names were misspelled, identities blurred, and people without strong documentation slipped through the cracks. For someone already poorly recorded on the original manifest, it became almost impossible to be accurately traced afterward. If he did not have influential advocates, media interest, or official backing, his survival simply failed to register in the historical record. Silence, in this case, was not chosen, It was imposed. There was also a deeper, more uncomfortable reason for the omission. Acknowledging a black survivor challenged the dominant image of the Titanic tragedy as a story centered on white heroism, class sacrifice, and noble loss. Early 20th century society was not prepared to spotlight black experiences in moments of global attention. Including his story would have required recognizing that black lives were present, vulnerable, and worthy of remembrance in one of history's most famous disasters. It was easier for institutions to ignore what complicated the narrative. Over time, this absence hardened into fact. Historians referencing early documents found no clear trace of him, and the assumption grew that he had never been there. His erasure became self-reinforcing. No records meant no acknowledgement, and no acknowledgement meant no further investigation. Only decades later, when he finally spoke and independent researchers began to question the gaps, did the truth surface. His disappearance from early records stands as a powerful reminder that history is not just about what happened. It is also about who was allowed to be seen, named, and remembered. The night the Titanic struck the iceberg unfolded with a terrifying calm that masked the scale of what was about to happen. For many on board, including him, the impact did not feel like a violent crash, but more like a strange shudder, a long, unsettling vibration that traveled through the ship's steel bones. Conversations paused. Footsteps slowed. People looked at one another, confused rather than afraid. For someone accustomed to being overlooked, there was no official explanation offered to him, no reassurance given. Information flowed unevenly that night, and those on the margins felt the uncertainty first. As minutes passed, the atmosphere began to change. Crew members moved with urgency, their voices sharper, their expressions tighter. Doors were opened, orders whispered, then repeated more firmly. Cold Atlantic air rushed into corridors as hatches were uncovered. He would have sensed danger before it was openly announced, reading it in body language rather than words. The ship that had promised unsinkable safety suddenly felt fragile, and the divide between those who were informed and those who were not became painfully clear. When the truth finally emerged, that the Titanic was fatally wounded, panic spread unevenly. First, class areas buzzed with confusion and disbelief, while lower sections struggled to understand what was happening at all. Instructions were inconsistent, and access to upper decks was not equal. For him, navigating the ship in those moments meant pushing past fear, cold, and invisible barriers of class and race. Every hallway became a test of resolve. Every closed gate or guarded stairway reminded him that survival was not just about reaching a lifeboat, but about being allowed to reach one. The sounds of that night stayed with him forever: steam hissing, metal groaning, water rushing where it should not be, and voices rising in desperation. Above it all was the chilling realization that help was limited and time was running out. As the bow dipped lower into the black water, the illusion of order collapsed. The iceberg itself was long gone, but its damage was everywhere: tilting floors, slanted walls, and a creeping cold that pressed urgency into every decision. That moment marked the line between life before the Titanic and everything that followed. A night etched into memory not as a single impact, but as a slow, horrifying understanding that the ship and the world as he knew it was going down. His personal survival experience was shaped by instinct, awareness, and the harsh reality that no one was looking out for him. As the ship's tilt became more noticeable and the cold air cut deeper, he understood that waiting for instructions could mean death. While others hesitated, trusting the authority of crew members or the promise of order, he relied on observation, watching where people moved, listening for changes in tone, and sensing when hesitation turned dangerous. Survival for him became an individual responsibility rather than a shared one. Moving through the ship was not simple. Passageways were crowded, lighting was uneven, and fear made people unpredictable. Access to upper decks was increasingly controlled, and unspoken rules about who belonged were hardened into barriers. He faced resistance not just from the chaos, but from attitudes that questioned his right to be there at all. Every step forward required quiet determination. He did not shout or demand attention. Instead, he navigated carefully, choosing moments when confusion created brief openings. In a disaster governed by hierarchy, invisibility became both a risk and, at times, a shield. When he reached the lifeboat area, the reality was brutal. Space was limited, and decisions were being made in seconds. Priority was given unevenly, and fear distorted judgment. He witnessed scenes of heartbreak, families torn apart, pleas ignored, courage collapsing into desperation. Securing a place meant acting without certainty, knowing that hesitation could cost everything. Whether he boarded a lifeboat at the last possible moment or found another means of escape, his survival was not the result of luck alone. It was the product of alertness, resilience, and a refusal to surrender to fear. After leaving the ship, the ordeal did not end. The cold was merciless, silence broken only by distant cries and the sound of water against wood. In that darkness, survival took on a different form, endurance rather than movement. He held on, physically and mentally, as the Titanic disappeared behind him, taking with it thousands of lives and the certainty of the world he had known. When rescue finally came, it marked not a victory, but the beginning of a lifelong burden. He had survived when so many had not, carrying memories of that night that would follow him for decades, long before he ever found the words to speak of them. Lifeboats, chaos, and unequal treatment collided in a way that exposed the deepest fractures aboard the Titanic. As the evacuation began, the idea of order quickly gave way to confusion. Crew members shouted conflicting commands, passengers moved in desperate waves, and the rules, women and children first, were applied unevenly, shaped as much by class and race as by urgency. For someone already accustomed to being questioned or ignored, the lifeboat decks were not places of refuge, but arenas of silent judgment. Lifeboats were launched half empty, while crowds still pressed behind barriers. Access points were guarded, sometimes loosely, sometimes aggressively, and decisions were made in moments that could not be appealed. First, class passengers were guided forward, reassured, and physically escorted. Others were left to interpret the situation on their own. For a black man, stepping toward a lifeboat meant confronting more than fear. It meant confronting assumptions about who deserved saving. Even without spoken words, body language, hesitation, and resistance made those assumptions clear. The chaos intensified as the ship's angle grew steeper. People surged forward, then pulled back, unsure whom to trust. Some lifeboats were lowered too soon, others too late. Amid the disorder, acts of bravery existed alongside moments of cruelty. He would have seen compassion in strangers and indifference in authority, all within minutes of each other. The randomness of survival became painfully obvious. Who lived was not solely determined by courage or morality, but by timing, proximity, and how others perceived your worth in that instant. Unequal treatment did not always announce itself loudly. It often appeared in small, devastating ways. A glance that lingered too long before allowing passage. A command repeated harshly to one person and gently to another. A space that suddenly disappeared. When someone stepped forward, these moments accumulated, shaping the path to survival. For him, Every second near the lifeboats carried the weight of knowing he might be the first pushed back, if fear turned into blame. When the boats finally pulled away, leaving hundreds behind, the injustice of the night became undeniable. Safety was not distributed fairly. It was filtered through social lines drawn long before the Titanic ever sailed. Watching the ship from the water, he would have understood that surviving the sinking was only part of the story. The greater truth was harder to face in one of humanity's greatest tragedies. Even mercy had limits, and not everyone was given the same chance to reach it. Life after the Titanic tragedy was marked by survival on the surface and silence underneath. Once the immediate shock faded, and the world moved on to memorials, inquiries, and headlines, he returned to a society that was largely uninterested in his experience. Survivors were expected to resume their lives, yet for him, life was permanently divided into before and after that night in the Atlantic. Sleep was often interrupted by memory, not dreams, echoes of screams, the cold, the darkness, and the knowledge of how close death had come. Public attention focused on famous names, heroic narratives, and romanticized sacrifice. His survival did not fit those themes, and there was little space for him to speak openly. Even when survivors were invited to share their stories, their voices were filtered through social bias. For a black man in the early 20th century, speaking about trauma risked disbelief, dismissal, or ridicule. Silence became a form of protection. He carried his story privately, sharing little or nothing, not because it lacked meaning, but because the world showed no readiness to hear it. Practical life continued with necessity. He worked, moved forward, and carried responsibilities. Yet the Titanic followed him everywhere. Job opportunities, social interactions, and daily routines were all shaped by the same inequalities that had existed before the disaster. There was no financial compensation, public recognition, or support network waiting for him. Unlike prominent survivors who published memoirs or were invited to lectures, he faded into the background of history, surviving not only a shipwreck, but a lifetime of being overlooked. As years turned into decades, the silence deepened. The tragedy became a legend retold in books and films, yet none of them reflected his reality. Each retelling that excluded him reinforced the idea that his experience did not count. Still, the memories did not fade. They aged with him, growing heavier as those who shared them passed away. Life after the Titanic was not just about living, it was about carrying a truth alone, waiting for a moment when the world might finally be willing to listen. The decades of silence that followed were not the result of forgetting, but of deliberate restraint shaped by fear, exhaustion, and lived experience. After surviving the Titanic, he learned quickly that telling his story did not bring comfort or validation. In a world where his voice already carried less weight, speaking about such a monumental event often invited doubt rather than empathy. People questioned his presence, challenged his memory, or dismissed his account outright. Over time, silence became easier than repeatedly defending the truth of his own survival. There were also emotional reasons for his quiet. Revisiting that night meant reopening wounds that never truly healed. Each retelling forced him back into the cold, the screams, and the helplessness of watching lives disappear into darkness. Without a supportive audience or safe space, speaking became an act of pain rather than release. Many survivors cope by sharing their trauma, but others survive by burying it. For him, silence was not weakness, it was endurance. Social reality reinforced that choice. As years passed, the Titanic transformed from tragedy into legend. Its story was shaped by books, films, and public memory that left no room for voices like his. There were no invitations to speak, no historians asking for his testimony, no platforms offering respect. Watching the story be told again and again without him confirmed what he already knew, the world had decided who mattered. Speaking up against that tide felt futile, even dangerous. Age eventually changed the weight of silence. As those around him passed on and time thinned the fear of consequence, the urgency to preserve truth grew stronger. He carried memories that would die with him if left unspoken. The silence that once protected him now threatened to erase him completely. Decades after the ship went down, his quiet was not broken by a desire for attention, but by a need for truth, to ensure that his life, his survival, and his place in history would finally be acknowledged before time closed the door forever. The moment he finally told his story came not with drama, but with quiet resolve. By then, more than 8 decades had passed since the Titanic slipped beneath the Atlantic, and he was an old man carrying memories older than many of the histories written about them. Time had taken away the fear of judgment, but it had also sharpened the urgency. He understood that if he remained silent any longer, his truth would disappear with him, leaving the historical record permanently incomplete. When he spoke, it was not to seek sympathy or recognition, but to correct absence. His words were careful, measured, and grounded in lived detail, the kind that cannot be fabricated or borrowed from books. He described sensations rather than spectacle, the sound of water moving where it should not, the way people avoided looking at one another as panic set in, the cold that felt alive against the skin. These were not rehearsed stories shaped for attention. They were memories preserved through decades of restraint. At first, his account was met with hesitation. Historians and listeners questioned how such a survivor could have remained unknown for so long. But as details aligned with overlooked records, timelines, and lesser-known documents, skepticism began to fade. His story did not contradict the Titanic narrative. It exposed the parts that had been left out. The very fact that he spoke so late became proof of the forces that had silenced him in the first place. Telling his story was not closure, it was release. It allowed him to reclaim ownership of his experience and to step out of historical shadow, if only briefly. More importantly, it challenged how history is constructed, reminding listeners that truth does not always arrive on time. Some stories wait decades, not because they are false, but because the world was not ready to hear them. When he finally spoke, it was history, not memory, that had to catch up. When historians began to examine his account seriously, the process was slow, cautious, and deeply revealing. At first, his testimony stood alone, unsupported by the familiar passenger lists and widely cited survivor records. Skepticism was natural in a field built on documentation, yet the very gaps in the records raised questions. Researchers started looking not just at what was written, but at what was missing. That shift in approach marked the beginning of a reassessment of the Titanic's historical narrative. Verification did not come from a single document, but from patterns. Historians compared his memories with ship layouts, timelines of the sinking, and lesser-known operational details that were not widely publicized when he was younger. His descriptions aligned with specific seas of events, sounds, and movements that only someone present could know. Details about lifeboat procedures, deck conditions, and the progression of chaos matched independent accounts recorded decades earlier, strengthening the credibility of his story. Researchers also widened their search beyond traditional Titanic archives. They examined immigration records, employment logs, port authority documents, and oral histories that had long been overlooked. In these fragmented sources, traces began to emerge, misspelled names, vague job descriptions, unexplained survivals that could plausibly connect to him. While no single record declared his presence outright, together they formed a compelling mosaic. His life intersected with the Titanic not as a footnote, but as a consequence of systemic neglect in record keeping. Ultimately, verification became less about proving that he was there and more about confronting why his presence had been erased. Historians acknowledged that earlier conclusions were shaped by incomplete and biased sources. His testimony forced the field to accept a broader truth. Historical accuracy is not only about what survives in ink, but about recognizing the human voices excluded from it. By validating his account, historians did more than confirm one man's survival. They exposed the limitations of history itself and affirmed that truth can exist long before it is officially recognized. His story fundamentally reshapes how we remember the Titanic because it challenges the idea that the tragedy was ever fully understood. For more than a century, the Titanic has been framed as one of the most documented disasters in history, yet his survival proves that even the most studied events can carry deep silences. The absence of his voice was not a minor oversight. It was a reflection of whose experiences were considered worthy of preservation. By bringing his story into the light, the Titanic narrative shifts from a closed chapter to an evolving one. Including his experience forces a reevaluation of heroism, suffering, and survival. The familiar stories often center on wealth, class sacrifice, and noble behavior, while overlooking how race and social position shaped access to safety. His survival highlights that inequality did not pause in the face of disaster. It intensified. Remembering the Titanic through his eyes exposes uncomfortable truths about how compassion, protection, and opportunity were unevenly distributed even in humanity's darkest moments. His story also changes how history itself is approached. It reminds us that official records are not neutral and that absence does not equal non-existence. Historians, educators, and storytellers are compelled to ask new questions. Who else was there but never named? Whose stories were lost because no one bothered to listen? The Titanic becomes not just a tale of a shipwreck, but a lesson in historical responsibility, the duty to look beyond polished archives and listen for voices buried by time and bias. Most importantly, his story restores humanity to the margins. It ensures that remembrance is not limited to monuments and famous names, but extended to those who endured in silence. By acknowledging his survival, we honor not only one man, but all those whose experiences were erased. The Titanic is no longer just a story of steel and ice. It becomes a reminder that history is incomplete until every voice, especially the forgotten ones, is given space to be heard.